Welcome, Dr. Reid.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's really wonderful to be able to put a jacket on again and feel a little bit like we're presenting like we used to. This is such an important topic. I want to thank everybody for joining today. We have some really interesting data to show you and some really keen insights. For those of you who aren't familiar with Sentient, just to give you a brief background, we quantify emotion, and we are a globally recognized pioneer in the automation of behavioral science. You can see some of the companies that we're fortunate to work with, and this particular presentation is about advertising and how do you get your tone right for the moment? How do you know that you have the right message? But we're not going to stop just at business impact with advertising. As part of this webinar today, we're going to talk about the social impact of your advertising and ways that you can understand whether you're having both a business and a social impact with the messages that you're putting out into the marketplace. It should go without saying that now is a difficult time for advertisers. This is from hotels.com. And as we all know, brands are really being judged about how we are communicating right now. And initially, when hotels.com came out with this spot, it was all about COVID-19 and the pandemic. And that is still highly relevant for brands right now. But there are other social issues that brands are now facing and trying to understand whether their messaging is right for the moment, is right, period, and especially in the moment. If you look at this ad, is anybody going to eat anything from that bowl of popcorn? Probably not. He's going to be social distancing for quite a while. Thinking about that more deeply, how about those advertisers where consumption of the food is actually part of the brand experience? Can any brand really continue to say that they're finger licking good right now? Hershey's, KFC, have all pulled ads that didn't reflect the new global pandemic-informed reality. These images, while they used to be about consumption delight, are likely invoking feelings of disgust and fear among viewers. Can we really go on ad with that same imagery and that same messaging that worked in the past? The answer really is no. The question is, how do you know what's right? And it's not just about the pandemic. Now, advertisers are facing a significant challenge in how to have their voices heard in an authentic way in the face of the George Floyd protests and what's happening in America and around the world due to racial inequality. How can you advertise at a time like this? How should you advertise at a time like this? Should you advertise at a time like this? Mistakes can happen very easily. Consumer mind states, as we see, are changing each day. And it can be, as we well know this ad, that a mistake that you make today may never go away. This is from PepsiCo a couple of years ago. It was tone deaf at the time, and it certainly is tone deaf now. It's not running on air, but that doesn't mean consumers have forgotten. Take a look at this post on the left. Liked by 128,000 others. When the world needed her most, she vanished. And the one on the right, liked by 81,000 others. Only one person can save us now, and that's Kendall Jenner. The brand damage on this spot just continues and continues. The irony for me, as a tester of advertising, is that the negative impact of this ad could have been revealed in 2 hours with automated implicit testing. And in fact, here is data on that ad. A 2-hour test measuring the change in implicit attitude towards your brand shows that a single exposure to this Kendall Jenner ad actually reduces positive sentiment towards the PepsiCo brand, the Pepsi brand. If you had that data and you were about to launch this ad, you might not launch it. And it might not come back to hurt you again 2 years later when the themes are even more poignant. But do you follow the trends of the time? Do you follow what's happening out there right now? Let's watch a few of these and see if you recognize any of this from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic response in the US. All of these ads had a very similar theme. You remember the piano and the slow moving music, and they were meant to be caring and in touch with what was happening. But if everybody's doing that, is your message breaking through? And perhaps more importantly, is it authentic coming from your brand? The ones that are obvious stand out. If you've seen this from Volkswagen, it doesn't require testing to know that this is not something that you want to be putting out from your brand. In fact, the Volkswagen executives said they were appalled by the ad, and it was pulled immediately. But what about your advertising that's less obviously negative or reinforcing a negative implicit bias? Here's one from Planet Fitness. How do you know if your ad is tone deaf or not? From Planet Fitness, hate has no place in the world or in the judgment-free zone. This is an example of a brand trying to be true to what they stand for as a brand. But does it play well for that brand right now? I don't know. If I were Planet Fitness, I would want to test that. And I'd want feedback immediately. I would want to know before I put that out in the market whether this was having the intended influence that I was hoping it would have. The intention here is good. Is the execution right? I don't know, but a test would tell you. If you're going to test your advertising, you need to know two things. You need to know both whether your ad is going to be engaging with your audience emotionally, and perhaps more importantly, is it going to influence perceptions of your brand? And in this webinar, we're going to show you how to test not only for influence on your brand, but how you can test for influence on perceptions of other groups of people, so that you can actually test and incorporate as a KPI into your advertising testing whether an ad both has a business and a social impact. With engagement, we're going to focus today on affect, which is the emotional response to your ad. And we're going to show you a lot of examples of how you can do this as an automated way online in 24 hours using facial coding of emotion data. And then we're going to combine that with influence data. And influence really means the impact on your brand or on perceptions, in this case, of other groups of people. It has to change attitudes. It can't just be entertainment. It needs to change attitudes. And we're going to do that by using implicit association testing. So you know whether your advertising is getting through at an unconscious level in the way that you intend for your advertising. So let's focus on influence first. To study influence, we're going to use implicit association testing. And this is activated through Sentient Prime, which is a patented and automated behavioral science platform that measures implicit associations in the mind. I'll show you what those are in a second. A video is going to show on the right-hand side here of the screen. You'll see that primes are appearing. In this case, it's brand names, and respondents or people who are in your study are asked to sort emotions into positive and negative categories. You can see that they're swiping negative emotions away from themselves in a natural gesture, and they're pulling positive emotions toward themselves. Note that we're not asking them any questions about the brand. We're just priming them with the brand, and then seeing what that activates cognitively in their non-conscious minds. If the brand automatically activates positive emotions, they can sort positive emotions correctly more quickly. If the brand automatically is associated with negative emotions, they can sort negative emotions following that prime more quickly. We measure cognitive facilitation and cognitive dissonance. Essentially, it's a mental processing ability to measure the strength of associations in the neural networks that you have attached to brands. This technology has been around since 2007, and it is mobile and global. It has measured over 400 million subconscious associations in over 140 countries globally, and it's won multiple industry awards. So while this is built on new science, it is tried and tested within the marketplace to provide true implicit results. Here's how it works. you're presented with a prime. In this case, I'll stay on hotels.com. When you see hotels.com, the associations that you have with that brand become automatically activated in your mind. They become more cognitively accessible. And information that's more cognitively accessible has a greater influence on our behavior. So for example, when you see hotels.com, what commonly comes to mind? Is it safety? Is it authentic? Is it cheap? Is it disgusting? You may have associations of disgust, of feeling of travel and staying in hotel rooms, especially right now during COVID-19. Those associations give rise to emotion, and emotions influence our behavior. So depending on what automatically comes to mind, the strength of those associations, in marketing lingo, we've always called that top of mind. We simply now have a neural basis for that language that we've always known, those principles that we've always practiced. Whatever comes to mind is going to influence the emotions that you feel. And those emotions are going to drive your behavior toward or away from the object of interest. In this case, it's the brand, hotels.com. So let's take a look at hotels.com. We have this ad, hotels.com places. It's a 30-second spot. And if you're familiar with Captain Obvious, it's difficult for a brand like hotels.com to stay true to its brand and also communicate something important during a time of crisis. During the COVID-19 pandemic, how does a brand like hotels.com advertise well? Well, what we want is, in this case, to evaluate, to answer that question, we don't want to rely on somebody's opinion of our ads. If we're trying to make an important decision, we would rather rely on causal evidence of the efficacy of our advertising rather than casual opinions of whether someone thinks our advertising is going to work or not. It's how we like to make decisions when we're making important decisions. We want to make decisions based on scientific evidence, not opinions, ideally. So in a pre-post experimental design, a scientific design, you can actually test whether a single exposure to your ad has an impact on implicit feelings towards your brand. And here are some real data from exposure to the hotels.com places 30-second spot. We're showing you pre-exposure and post-exposure implicit associations towards brands following with the exposure to hotels.com ad in the middle of those two exposures. So this is pre-post. That means it's causal change. The only thing that's happened here is exposure to advertising, and we're looking at a change in attitude that can be attributed to that exposure. Above 100 on this scale is a positive association. Below 100 on the scale is a negative association. So as you can see here, we're denoting the significant differences with asterisks. A single exposure to hotels.com places ad increases associations, positive associations, significantly. It actually flips the sign, and associations go from a negative place to a positive place. And this ad for hotels.com does it while diminishing the implicit attitudes towards a couple of competitive brands. This is an influence measure, and it's gold. If I had one measure that I wanted to run to understand whether my ad should be run or not, it would be this measure. This is a non-conscious measure of implicit attitude towards a brand after a single exposure to my ad. If I have this data, I know whether to run my ad or not. If you remember PepsiCo Kendall Jenner from a few slides back, the relationship was in the opposite direction. You don't run that ad. This ad, you're okay. But if you're an advertiser, a brand advertiser or a creative, you probably want to know not just whether your ad is effective, but why. And that's where we really need to get into emotional engagement with an advertisement. And we're going to do that by looking at a technology called Sentient Expression. This is a facial action coding platform that's automated and it's online, and it provides emotional expression data in a reliable scientific way. Sentient Expression records respondents' expressions through webcams, and this is all opt-in, so people are being paid for their time in a survey. We ask them, would you be okay with us recording your face while we show you an advertisement? Obviously, it's kept anonymous, data is removed, and they either opt in or opt out of that. So this is an opt-in technology, and it's online through webcams, which means it's globally scaled. And it's an efficient platform for investigating natural responses to your media under real world conditions. These are the same conditions within which consumers are watching your ads while they're on your computer and you've got your ad placed within their YouTube feed. It detects emotional expressions and it reveals the percentage of consumers who are expressing an emotional response at any given moment during an experience. We're going to show you some data from that hotels.com ad that shows you the emotional expression while people are watching that ad. And we'll show you a couple of different lines here. The blue line that's going to come across the screen moment by moment is overall emotional engagement. This is the percentage of people who are expressing any emotion on their face while they're watching an ad. And emotional engagement is a really critical measure for understanding your breakthrough, whether you can capture and captivate attention. Emotional engagement is critical for that. And the reason that it's total emotional engagement and not just positive emotion is because the enemy of good advertising is not the presence of negative emotion. The enemy of good advertising is actually the absence of any emotion. The presence of negative emotion can be very effective, especially if you are trying to take consumers on a story arc where your brand is the potential salve to the negative emotion that you're presenting. If your brand or your product or your service is the solution to a pain point for consumers, the presence of negative emotion in your advertising can be very effective. So we don't want to discount negative emotion. It can be very important, but it needs to be intended negative emotion. When you have unintended negative emotion, that is, consumers are feeling negative emotion when you don't want them to, that is the sign of a non-optimized, emotionally engaging ad. So emotional engagement will be the blue line. Valence, which is positive versus negative, it's actually the ratio of positive over to negative, is going to appear in a green line on the bottom. And you'll see when it's green, it's shaded green, that means the net emotion is positive. When it goes into the red territory, the net emotion is negative across all respondents. And then we'll show you two more data points. We're going to lay in a couple of additional lines that show you negative emotion and the emotion discussed on the faces of those people who felt less safe after watching this ad. They felt hotels.com was less safe after watching this ad. And what you'll see when we lay in those lines is that those two groups have an important and telling emotional response at a key moment in this ad. Here we go. Places.
Do you remember places? Like this place. Remember how this was a place? Oh, so placey. The good news is these places still exist, with hundreds of thousands of not your house places all over the world. Hotels.com is the best place to book a place. And in case things are still weird later, just choose free cancellation. Hotels.com. Book now, travel later. Amazing.
In case things are still weird later, just a few things to notice on this. First of all, notice the emotional engagement line. That's a really good line. It's increasing emotional engagement across the time course of the ad. So you're engaging initially, you've got a nice rise in the beginning, and then you see it continue to rise across the time course of that ad, meaning that consumers are staying engaged right to the very end. Now, if you look at the valence line, it's largely net positive, which is good because this is intended to be a funny ad. But look at the undulation there, about 2/3 of the way through. Each of those rising points coincides with a joke point from the ad. I love that. It tells the creative that, hey, your jokes are landing. And it tells the researcher that, hey, facial coding is sensitive enough to capture emotional response to slight jokes in a narrative second by second across the ad. Love that illustration. Your jokes are landing, it's effective for your brand, and the facial coding of emotion data is capturing the effectiveness of your creative execution. But there's a real important point here that can't be missed by the advertisers and the creatives if you're trying to optimize this ad. It's very close. Great emotional engagement line, continues to the end. But look at the emotion among those people who feel that hotels.com is less safe after watching this ad. Their emotional response, their negative emotional response rises at the point where Hotels.com has to remind everybody that you might have to cancel this reservation. Let's watch that.
Things are still weird later. Just choose free cancellation. Beautiful. Hotels.com. Book now, travel later. Amazing.
Among those people who feel less safe about Hotels.com, their negative reaction is right at that moment. It's after the joke. The feel things weird later, it's after that. It's when free cancellation comes up. You're reminding the audience in a non-optimal way that this isn't an ideal time to travel. And it's making people feel less safe about Hotels.com. Right up until that end card, right up until those last 2 to 3 seconds, this is really brilliant. But it's non-optimized at the end. And that's where the work needs to be done from a creative perspective.
Do you remember?
So we have influence, which is going to be implicit impact on the brand. And we have engagement, which is going to be emotional response moment by moment while you're watching ads. In preparation for this webinar, we put a vote out on Twitter, and we asked everybody to vote on the ad that they would most like to see advertised. And we had out of 2,636 votes. We looked at E-Trade buying the dips, Jeep, Big Picture, Hotels.com, Places, and Facebook's Born in Quarantine. The winner is Jeep. So Jeep is the winning ad, and honestly, I think this probably is more indicative of what explicit questions really give you. This is probably more of a popularity contest on brands rather than a voting on the advertisement. Nonetheless, we're going to analyze it for you and show you whether this ad is actually effective or not. Here is Jeep, Big Picture. And this is Jeep trying to stay true to its brand and its brand's promise during quarantine, during a time when people aren't feeling freedom, which is one thing that Jeep really stands for. Let's watch the ad.
If you think about the last few months, maybe it'll give us a new perspective. Maybe we'll see things we've been missing. Maybe it'll help us see just how connected we all are. And maybe, just maybe, if we look at the big picture, it'll remind us just how amazing freedom really is.
It's supposed to be inspirational, right? You've got that charging music, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, right to the end. It's supposed to be uplifting. And it's actually an ad that has a great deal of potential. In fact, a single exposure to this ad raises implicit emotional appeal towards Jeep significantly. It doesn't do anything to the associations towards Ford Ranger, but it actually does give a lift to Land Rover as well. So there is more than just brand communication going on here. There is off-road vehicle category lift going on with exposure to this advertising. So you are getting a lift for Jeep, but you're also getting a lift from one of your high-end competitors, Land Rover, for off-road. So that's an unintentional boost. We're obviously not trying to boost Land Rover by running our advertising, but we are getting a boost for Jeep. How could this ad be optimized to make sure that we're staying true to what Jeep stands for? Well, in addition to understanding the emotional appeal impact of your ad, we often want to know how exposure to an advertisement changes implicit associations with our brand at the attribute level. And in these kinds of tests, we'll test both positive and negative brand attributes. For this particular ad, we tested some positive attributes, including freedom, pride, and authentic coming from this brand. And you see the pre-post change in emotion there. No change in pride, but a significant decline in associations of freedom with Jeep, and a significant decline in authentic as an attribute with Jeep. And for an ad about freedom, the decline in that brand attribute association is really troubling. And at a time like this, we also do not want our advertising to come across as inauthentic. And so the decline in authenticity is also an issue for this ad. So if we're the brand managers or if we're the advertiser, If we're the creative, we better figure out what's going on here. We're getting a lift for Jeep, which means this ad has potential, but we're seeing significant declines in a couple of key brand attributes. How do you understand why? How do you understand why we're seeing a decline in these attributes? Well, that's where the power of combining this causal change in implicit attitude with facial coding of emotion data comes in. You see, we've got data on the same individuals. We have their attitudes before we showed the advertisement. We have their emotional expressions while they're watching the advertisement. And then we have their attitudes after the advertisement. What that means is we can create groups of people who have either a positive change or a negative change in attitude. And we can look at the different emotional experience of those two groups. And that allows us to look at which moments of an ad are related to the causal change in implicit attitudes in consumers.
If you think about the last few months,
I'm going to pause here and show you this ad again as we go deeper on Jeep, since it was most voted for. We'll show you the emotional experience overall. The red line is going to be negative emotion expressed on the face. The green line is positive emotion expressed on the face. And the blue line is overall emotional engagement across the entire time course of the ad. You're going to see a few key moments here and see if you can identify, as this plays, the key moment in this ad that is non-optimized in the creative for the brand.
maybe it'll give us a new perspective. Maybe we'll see things we've been missing. Maybe it'll help us see just how connected we all are. And maybe, just maybe, if we look at the big picture, it'll remind us just how amazing freedom really is.
First of all, let's talk about emotional engagement. This has some promise, and it has a lot of negative emotion in the beginning. That's not necessarily a bad thing. There is a question about whether they're dwelling on it too long, but negative emotion, and where does it come from? Because it starts off with reminding us about what we've been experiencing in the US for the last 3 months. Social isolation, a lack of freedom. That evokes a lot of negative emotion, and it shows on the face while you're reminding your audience of those experiences. It can be a good setup, but the question is, do you dwell there too long? But that's not necessarily the problem with this spot. As we do after the negative setup, you can see negative emotion starts to decline and positive emotion starts to rise. The narrative starts to say, you know, maybe we can do this and maybe we'll experience this. And then positive emotion rises, but look at that moment right in the middle of the ad. Right when we are expecting positive emotion to rise and Jeep to become the hero to all of this pain that we've been experiencing, what happens? It's not positive emotion. It's the negative emotion that returns. And that's unintended negative emotion. The negative emotion at the beginning of the ad is intended. It's trying to set up the story. The negative emotion in the middle of the ad when Jeep comes in as the hero is unintended, and it's not what you want in your advertising. Moreover, look at the line for positive emotion. If you were to draw a best fit line on the second half of that ad, it would be a negative slope. The first half of the ad would be positive, the second half would be a negative line for your slope, and your overall emotional engagement declines towards the end of the ad. When your overall emotional engagement declines, people are leaving the room. They're turning over their phones. They're clicking skip ad. We have to continue to engage the audience emotionally from beginning to end. And when the brand is supposed to come in as the hero, that's when we want the positive emotion, not the negative emotion. So let's dig a little bit deeper on this. We saw that there was a decline in attitude of freedom towards Jeep after exposure to this ad. That's a problem because this ad is about freedom. And Jeep is supposed to be the brand that's going to give you freedom in the coming months. If we take that causal change data on freedom, that is, we look at the people who actually had a decline in associations of freedom with Jeep, and we look at their emotional experience, we can gain insight into the moments of the ad that are related to the brand attribute decline that we don't want. And that's the first step in optimizing your creative. Identify the moments that aren't working based on the outcomes that matter to you, the KPIs, the key performance indicators that matter to you. In this case, the attribute freedom is an important one. So we're going to show you overall positive emotion here, which is slight. We're going to show you overall negative emotion, and then we're going to lay in the line that is negative emotion among those people who had a decrease in associations of freedom with the Jeep brand. Let's take a look at that.
If you think about the last few months, maybe it'll give us a new perspective. Maybe we'll see things we've been missing. Maybe it'll help us see just how connected we all are. And maybe, just maybe, if we look at the big picture, it'll remind us just how amazing freedom really is.
It's not what you want. And if you had this data and freedom as a brand attribute was one of your key outcomes, one of your key performance indicators for this brand, you'd go right back to that point. And it's the point where the narrator says, maybe, just maybe. And you'd identify what's happening there. It pans out to the big picture. But it's that narrative that's not the right narrative for this moment. Right now, people don't need more uncertainty. Maybe is an uncertain term. And the whole narrative is around maybe. We're trying to give hope with that, but maybe, just maybe, is really just reinforcing the uncertainty of the moment. It's actually reinforcing the idea that this is not a moment of freedom. And you can see the negative emotional response at that moment in the ad among people who have a decrease in associations of freedom with your brand. It's amplified again when it's obvious that they're not out there in their Jeep or in freedom, in the wild, and then it spikes again at the end when the word freedom is mentioned. The narrative isn't working there. This ad has potential, but it's not optimized. And if you were optimizing this ad, you'd go right to that moment where you're trying to come in with positive emotion, but your positive emotion is declining, and your negative emotion is increasing among people who are having a change in attitude that you don't want. Those two case studies focus on key performance indicators or KPIs that are business oriented, lift and appeal of your brand, and change in implicit attitudes towards your brand. But what if business outcomes weren't your only KPIs? I don't know if anybody's familiar with the E-Trade ad that's out right now, but it's about buying on the dips. And it has the potential to be a strong ad and to be inclusive, but the cut downs of this ad may actually be reinforcing biases that we are not intended and that are not desired, biases towards other groups of people. This ad wasn't voted as a winner, but we do have the data on this ad if you're interested. It begs the question, what if decreasing implicit racial bias was one of your advertising KPIs? I'm going to pause here for a second and just dwell on that for a second. What if we were looking for social impact in addition to business impact with our advertising? And reduction in implicit racial bias was actually a key performance indicator for our ads, was something that helped us decide whether to go forward with an ad or not. What if we could treat ad testing like other diagnostic testing, like medical testing, by collecting scientific evidence rather than relying on opinions? And I'm going to show you over on the right-hand side how you can do that. For those of you who are familiar with implicit testing, you'll know that Sentient Prime and other implicit tools were born out of the social psychology literature. This technique was originally developed to study stereotypes and biases. Because when you're studying stereotypes and biases, if you ask somebody, do you have a bias towards this group of people? And you ask that question explicitly, you're not going to get an answer that's reliable. You're not going to get an answer that you can really rely on and take action from, because people either won't tell you that they have a bias, but the more pernicious problem is that people actually often can't tell you because they're not aware that they have these biases. but everybody has biases. That's how the mind works, both positively and negatively. So these techniques were developed to be able to measure implicit bias towards other groups of people without relying on any explicit questions. In business, we've taken that technique and we've applied it to brands because it really is a technique that can answer any question that people may be not willing or able to admit to you. But it's really rewarding to see this technique come full circle and now come back to be applied to racial stereotypes and racial biases. So on the right-hand side here, you're going to see a video of the platform testing automatic implicit associations with race instead of with brands. Now your primes are faces of people, not brands. And the speed with which you can sort words into us versus them categories gives us an implicit measure of social inclusivity. How inclusive do you feel towards groups of people? And we're not asking you any questions. We're measuring what happens automatically in your non-conscious mind. What if this was an outcome variable for your advertising? What if you wanted to see a positive change in this measure due to exposure to your advertising? And what if all advertisers in the world began to adopt this as a standard key performance indicator for their advertising? We could have a significant impact in reducing the unintentional reinforcement of racial stereotypes and biases in the world. Let's see if it actually works. This is Facebook's Born in Quarantine. It's a 60-second spot. And while the goal was to provide comfort to mothers who are giving birth during quarantine, this actually has an important impact on attitudes towards other groups of people as well. This can be difficult to look at. I've presented a lot of this kind of data over the years, and this is implicit emotional appeal toward Black people. Pre-exposure and post-exposure for this ad. If you remember from the beginning of the presentation, below 100 is negative. And I say that's hard to present because it's scientific evidence of what we're all facing and looking at today in our worlds. There is an implicit, on average, negative implicit bias towards Black people. The good news from this slide is that a single exposure to Born in Quarantine has a significant lift in reducing that negative implicit bias towards Black people. Wow. What if that was one of your KPIs for advertising? Let's take it a step further and show you the data, the emotional expression on the face of people while they watch this ad. And we're going to split it among two. We're going to show you data for two groups of people at a couple of points in this ad. One of the groups of people is those people who had reduced bias towards Black women. Remember, we looked at change, bias before, bias after. We can pinpoint those people who actually have a reduction in implicit bias, and then look at their emotional experience during the ad and pinpoint the moments of the ad that are related to that outcome that we're looking for, that social outcome we're looking for. We're also going to show you data among those people who felt this was an authentic ad coming from Facebook. Let's watch it.
I was born during a quarantine. I don't remember it, of course, but for my mother, it was a very difficult time. She told me it was just you and me for many months. But she wasn't alone. Everybody tried to do what they could to help. But she was also a very strong person. And then it was over. We came out into a new world, my mother and me. We can get through this. We all have the strength to do it. I'm 100 years old, and you just take care of that little miracle.
Really well done ad. That ad is good for the brand. Because It's good for people. It has a business and a social impact. And look at the emotional response among the people who have reduced implicit bias towards Black women. What moment is it? It's the moment where the Black woman is giving birth to her child. They have a positive emotional response, an amplified positive emotional response at that moment. That means the people who have the change in attitude that you're trying to change, if you're trying to change attitudes towards other people, that's the moment that's strongly related to that implicit change. So in your cut down from 60 to 30 to 15, if you're trying to make a social impact, if you're trying to reduce implicit bias, negative implicit bias towards Black women, don't lose that moment. That's a moment. And the moment about strength and that we can get through this is the amplified emotional moment for people who feel that this is authentic coming from your brand. This is key insight. If you're an advertiser who's trying to optimize your ads for both business and social impact, you want causal change in attitudes, and you want to be able to cut your data, your emotional experience data, by that causal change. It allows you to pinpoint the moments that are related to the change you're looking for, both from a business perspective and a social perspective. Don't lose those moments. But what about advertising that goes right at implicit bias? The Facebook Born in Quarantine ad isn't intentionally going at implicit bias. P&G's The Look from last year is intentionally going at implicit bias. And see what impact it has on the brand, but more importantly, the objective of this ad. What is the impact of this ad on attitudes towards Black people? And this is that us versus them exercise that we showed you. It's called Implicit Inclusivity. And I want to give credit to Christina Zolcius and Cyrus McCandless, the scientists behind the development of this technique for Sentient. Christina Zolcius now at Google, Cyrus McCandless, VP of Scientific Discovery and Innovation at Sentient. Really genius work, and it's a pleasure working with you. This is important data. Before exposure to the ad, the automatic implicit association with Black people is in the negative direction. It's a them group. After a single exposure to the look, the attitude is significantly changed in a positive direction. It's not just in reducing negative, it's actually flipped the sign into the positive direction. This ad is having a social impact in the direction that P&G intends. So let's take a look at it and while we watch this ad, you'll see overall valence towards the ad. It's a very emotional ad. You're gonna see some positive moments, you're gonna see some negative moments. Overall, there's a lot of mixed emotion. But what I really want you to focus on is the positive emotion that's expressed among those people who end up feeling more inclusive towards Black people after this ad is over. We're gonna lay in that line about midway through this ad, and there's a key moment where you're gonna see an emotional change among those people who have a change in implicit attitude. Let's watch it. These are very low valence scores. It's really beautiful. See, brands can have both a business and a social impact with their advertising. So let's do it. Let's make reduction of implicit bias a new KPI for brand advertisers. You can measure it. You can pinpoint the moments that actually reduce implicit bias. And you can do it right now. You don't have to wait. You don't have to be in a lab. You can do this online with automated behavioral science. How fast can you get this insight? You can know in a day whether your ad reduces implicit bias and is good for your brand. It's the combination of automated facial coding with automated implicit association testing. Facial action coding to measure moment-by-moment emotional response, and implicit associations to measure the impact on your brand, and if you want, impact on perceptions of other groups. This is called rapid subtext. Results are delivered in 24 hours. You can have go, no-go decisions in less than a day. You can understand the true causal impact of your advertising. You don't have to rely on people's opinions of whether your ad is going to be effective or not. You can actually amass scientific evidence to know whether your ad is effective or not for your business and for the world. And you can understand why. By combining these metrics, you know not just what your ad is doing, but you know why it's doing it, and that allows you to optimize your advertising. It's not delivered in a PowerPoint, it's delivered in a dashboard. You can work with the data. You can cut the data by the different attributes that you include. You can reveal emotional changes and appeal towards your brand and your custom attributes and see which moments of your ad are related to that. And if you implement this to make social change, you have the potential to increase empathy for the human condition with automated behavioral science. Depending on what your needs are, you can measure just engagement with your ad. That's the moment by moment emotional expression while people are watching your ad. You can measure just the influence of your ad. That's the gold option. That is, what's the actual impact of your ad, not somebody's opinion, scientific evidence of the impact. And then finally, if you want to know both, you just get both engagement and influence. And then you can cut the data by the outcome variables, the KPIs that you're most interested in. And when I say it's automated, it is truly automated. This is the process. You upload your brand logo. You drag and drop your ad file. You select the audience that you want to understand and press go. And then in your dashboard, within 24 hours, you get your results. This is a tool that allows marketers to avoid marketing missteps right now at a time when you have to know. You can visit bit.ly/rapid subtext and find out more about that. And I want to end with this sentiment. Thank you to the scientists who developed these techniques back in the mid-90s, if you can believe it. Over 25 years ago, these techniques were developed in the behavioral science literature. We're finally in business in a new age of research. This is the age of implicit research. We don't have to rely simply on what people say in surveys. We can actually measure causal change in implicit attitudes in the non-conscious mind. And that means a lot of things for advertisers. First of all, the more we understand about the implicit impact of our communications, the greater our ability to have both a social and business impact with our marketing. And second, we're now in a place where we should be basing our decisions on causal evidence, not casual opinions. We don't have to rely on casual opinions to know whether to launch our ads or not. We actually can have scientific evidence to drive those decisions. All right, and we're going to open up for questions and answers. We got some questions. Let's see if we have some answers. Wonderful. Yes. Can you test animatics at early stage concept development with the same accuracy? That's a wonderful question. Thank you for that. And yes, the answer, we'll answer that live. The answer is yes, you can. And in fact, I think what's so promising among these techniques is that if you use it further upstream, you haven't wasted a lot of your production costs to produce your final copy before you know whether your storyline is going to be, before you know your storyline is going to be effective or not. So the answer is yes, facial coding does detect emotion during the experience of animatics. And it's really useful to use it upstream. Early stage testing allows you to maximize your advertising spend budget. Don't go down roads that aren't going to be promising. Choose the roads that have the greatest promise for your brand. Answer, okay, can your facial coding measure shorter ads under 30 seconds? Absolutely, yes. Facial coding can be used to test much shorter formats and does so very effectively. A lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to keep going. In places, how would you handle the free cancellation message? That's a great question. So free cancellation has got to be the key to that, right? Because that's what they're trying to say, book now, travel later. But that end card isn't optimized because the book now, travel later comes in the tagline underneath the brand. And the book now, travel later is what is said by the narrator. We do a lot of work on optimizing end cards here at Sentient. And the first thing that we notice when we look at that is that the setup for free cancellation isn't right. From a behavioral science perspective, what you do by saying free cancellation is you trigger, oh, cancellation. Oh yeah, there are places like this, but that's not real for me right now. In fact, the notion of actually going there right now makes me feel negative or feel some disgust. The book now, travel later, if that was primed earlier in the ad, the potential for free cancellation to have a positive impact would be much greater. That is, you've primed in their minds the idea that, oh yeah, I can plan this trip that I've been wanting to take right now and travel later. And the risk of that is removed from me because there's free cancellation, but it's not set up well. With a better setup, with a priming of the non-conscious mind, you'd be in a place to deliver that free cancellation message in a more effective way. That answers that question. That's great. Okay, I got a question on price. Absolutely. Not trivial question at all. I think that's one of the really important things here. By automating behavioral science, we can put this in the hands of any researcher. And the pricing on a premium offer, meaning both engagement and influence, is under $3,500. Any and every brand advertiser that has budget to spend, media budget to spend, ought to be testing their ads with this to find out if it's right for their brand. That cost is really trivial when you consider it relative to the media production spend and the media buy spend. Great. Okay. Do you have examples of brands that have used implicit association testing to increase inclusivity in their advertising? Yes, we do. In fact, this is one of the projects that I'm most proud of at Sentient over the last 10 years. This was done a couple of years ago by Diageo. One of their brands was, their goal was to make people feel more inclusive of others. And so shout out to Luke Atkinson, if you're watching this, for spearheading that initiative inside of Diageo. And Jason Shabib for supporting that work. The goal of that testing was to make sure that the advertising put out was good for the brand. Obviously you wanted to be good for the brand, but a key KPI in that research was understanding whether it actually made people feel more inclusive of others. And through testing and through global benchmarking of implicit inclusivity towards different racial groups, we were able to identify which ads within that campaign were more or less effective at increasing implicit attitudes of social inclusivity towards groups of people. It was a great piece of work. You can find details of that online. Social inclusivity with Diageo and Sentient Decision Science.